What's the everyday meaning of the standard deviation? This is perhaps the most important part of this lecture, at least the second half of this lecture, is understanding what a standard deviation actually means. Because if you understand this, you'll understand an awful lot of how humans vary from one another and how to express what that variation means. So assuming that the distribution is normally distributed, so it's like something that's regular, what we'd normally expect with humans, one standard deviation around the means most scores. Most scores. So if the normal score is right down in the middle here, the normal score of the standard deviation is gonna be one standard deviation, or most scores are going to be within one standard deviation, and almost all scores are going to be within two standard deviations. For example, suppose that on a test the average score was 85 with a standard deviation of 10. That means that most of the scores in the class, over half, probably around 68%, would be 85 plus or minus 10. So between 75 and 95, because 10 is the standard deviation, and almost all scores will be between 85 plus or minus 20, plus or minus 2 times the standard deviation. So 85 plus or minus 20 would be between 65 and 105. Almost all scores would be there. There'd be a few, maybe 5% that would be outside of that range. But a standard deviation of 10 would mean that they would almost all be within two standard deviations, that is 65 to 105. Now, we also mentioned a third way of measuring variation is the variance. And the variance is simply the square of the standard deviation. Now, that's kind of a strange thing to use, especially if the standard deviation is measured in burritos, then the squared deviation is going to be burrito squared. But the advantage of using the square of the deviation is that it doesn't have a square root, and we can add things together real easily. And there's just a lot of algebra that's useful without having the square deviation. Now, in this course, we won't be discussing variance one enough, but if you were to take a more advanced statistics course, especially if you were using a lot of ANOVA tests and for various things, you would talk about variance quite a bit. But for this course, it's just good to know that when somebody's talking about variance, it's pretty much the same thing as a standard deviation. It's calculated the same way, except it's squared. There's no square root involved.